Well, I'll come down here this time, come down off my high horse if everything's all right with y'all. It's nice to see that not everybody left. That's always an encouragement between services. I remember a few months back I did an expository sermon. That's a Tom Childers word for you. An expository sermon starting in James chapter 1. And I'd like to pick up where I left off. I don't remember what month it was. It's very easy for me to get my days mixed up. But I remember I left off on verse 8. And that's what we'll pick up back in verse 9. And I just love the book of James. It's such a great study. It's a very practical book, just very practical. There's so many things from it that you can apply. And right here, we'll start in verse 9. This is looking at the perspective of the rich and poor. James says, Let the lowly brother glory in exaltation, but the rich in his humiliation, because as a flower of the field he will pass away. For no sooner is the sun risen with the burning heat, then it withers the grass, its flower falls, and its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits. When we read about verse 9, when we study verse 9, when it says, Let the lowly brother glory in exaltation, that kind of reminds me of a familiar verse to us in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, at the latter part of the verse, where Peter says, God resists the proud, but does what to the humble? Gives grace to the humble. You see how both halves live. And he says in verse 10, but the rich brother, the rich one, he only glories in his humiliation, because as a flower of the field he will pass away. The Bible doesn't paint a very clear picture, a very pretty picture of those who put their riches and everything else that they have in this world before God, does it? Let's turn to a few of them right now. Let's turn to a familiar passage in Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13. This is the parable of the rich fool. It says, Then one from the crowd said to him, and him is talking about Jesus, he says, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. But he said to them, Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you? And he said to them, Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of things he possesses. Now let's slow down right here and let's realize, it's not a crime, it's not a sin, a horrible sin to want the best for ourselves, is it? No, we like to have enough to make do, enough to make ends meet. But he's saying right here, if that just overrides your mind, if that takes up every space in your mind and completely throws you off the track of serving the Lord, if that's the only thing in your life that you care about, that's not going to work. Just like Matthew 6, verse 24 says, you cannot serve God and man. If you can't serve two masters, you'll hate one and love the other, or you'll love the one and hate the other. You cannot serve God and mammon, God and money. And he says right here in verse 15, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. This rich man, he had so much. Everything that he did, it prospered. He was living it up. And he thought within himself, how we often think within ourselves from time to time, certain things, certain images pop into our mind, and we have to make certain choices. He's saying, you know what? I don't have any more room for my crops. What do I need to do? And he comes up with a decision right here in verse 18. He doesn't say, I'll give some to the poor. I'll put God first. I'll give some of what I have. I'll share it. Now he's saying right here, he's saying, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater. And there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease. Eat, drink, and be merry. It's kind of like kicking your shoes off and just sitting back and propping your feet up and living it up, having a good time, just basking in the glory of everything that you got going on. But God said to him in verse 20, Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. This will be the end of your life. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. That's the problem that the rich fool had. He was concerned with building up treasure on this earth. He wasn't He wasn't trying to store up treasure in heaven. You know, the things we have on this earth, they're going to pass away, aren't they? All the rich, if we have any fancy clothes, fancy vehicles, whatever, what fancy diamonds, what have you, you know, they're all going to pass away. Just like we're told in the familiar verses in Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 19 during the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Jesus is saying, you know, don't be concentrating on the things of this earth. They're not going to do you any good. They're not going to do your soul, your salvation, any good. But if you lay up treasures in heaven, that's what's going to make you live forever in glory by and by. And let's look at one more passage on this point. Let's think about Jesus counseling the rich young ruler in Matthew chapter 19. Starting in verse 16, this is somewhat similar to the parable of the rich fool. Jesus says, "Now behold, one came and said to him, 'Good teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life?'" You know, lay it out for me. Lay it all on the line. What do I need to do? So he said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but one, that is God. But if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments." He said to him, okay, he was curious. You know, it kind of piques people say things to us from time to time that pique our curiosity. And right here, the rich young ruler's curiosity was piqued. And he said, "Which ones? What do I need to do?" Jesus said, "You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. Honor your father and your mother. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself." The young man said to him, "You know what? I've done all that. I've done all these things. I've kept them since my youth. Yeah, I've done a great job. I'm complete. I have everything, all the variables that you need to inherit eternal life. I've got them." That's what the rich young ruler is saying. You know, what do I still lack? You know, the rich young ruler was acting like he could earn his salvation. Of course, we all know that we can't earn our salvation. But Jesus told him one more thing. He said, if you want to be perfect, you know, if you want to inherit eternal life, if you want to go to heaven, go. Sell what you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me. Self-sacrifice. But when the young man heard that saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. See, the rich young ruler, he couldn't separate himself from the treasure that he had, all the riches that he had on this earth. And the very sad part of it is, we don't hear anything more about the rich young ruler in the Bible. We just have the parallel passages. We don't hear any more about him. We don't know if he ever made that decision to give up everything that he had in this world or not. We just don't know, and that's very sad to think about. And he says in verse 11, going back to James chapter 1, he says, "For no sooner has the sun risen with the burning heat than it withers the grass. Its flower falls, and its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits." He's saying all the riches that he has, they'll all fade away. They'll all be for naught. And let's go ahead to verse 12. This is talking about loving God under trials. In verse 12, James says, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed." And I hear this all the time. Oh, I hear it so much. You know, God's tempting me. You know, people undergo struggles in this life, and they're saying, God's picking on me, God's tempting me. No, friend, God's not tempting you at all. God's not doing. God's not the one doing it. And let's turn to a very familiar verse right here. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. And right here, this verse right here, I hear it so often, and truthfully, it's one of the most misused and misapplied verses in the entire Bible. It truly is. This is just about temptation. This isn't about everything else. But so many people in the world today, they say, we're reading this verse right here. It says, "No temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man." Notice it's saying no temptation. "But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. You know, people go through so much in this life. They go through triumph and disaster, heartache. They go through heartbreak, sorrow. They lose a loved one. They go through all this, and they're saying, and they automatically, when they want to lift up their spirits, they want to lift up each other's spirits, they'll say, God says He'll never give us anything more than we can handle. Now, that's not talking about sorrow or heartbreak or heartache. No, that's just talking about temptation. When you say that, when you just automatically say that it covers everything, you're misusing the verse. You're misapplying the verse. Right here it's talking about temptation. And temptation, too, is so strong. It's just very strong. I'm checking to make sure my microphone's still on. I didn't want to turn it off accidentally. But it's so strong, and sin is so strong, it has such a hold on us. There's things that we undergo in this world. We all have our share of difficulties. There's some things that we can tough out. We can say, you know what, I can look inside my heart. I can look at the man in the mirror and say, you know what, I've got a bad circumstance. But you point to that man or the woman in the mirror and you say, you know what, you can overcome it. But friends, temptation is too much oftentimes. Sin is too much. Sin and Satan trying to rule over us, friends, that's not something that we can just tough out on our own. We have to turn to God for the answers. And he says right here in verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I'm tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does He Himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Satan's the one who entices us. Our own desires as well. Our evil heart, that's the one that we have to turn to. That's the one that draws us away. And there's people in the Bible that you can look at. We have many examples of those who face temptation. Some of them were able to overcome it. Some were not. A very famous example of somebody who couldn't overcome temptation. You turn to 2 Samuel chapter 11, and you look at the story of David and Bathsheba, and how Bathsheba was married to Uriah. How David one night sees Bathsheba, and he's just captivated by her. He just falls in love with her. He says, you know what, that's a beautiful woman. That's the one that I need to have for a wife. That she fits my eye. I think she'd be perfect. There's just one tiny little problem, something that David didn't quite get the gist of. There's one tiny problem. Bathsheba's married. To someone else, not David. That might be a little problem right there. And of course, what does David do? He allows this temptation to get the best of him. He has Uriah lured into battle and has Uriah killed. And then he's able to take advantage and use Bathsheba to his advantage, his love for Bathsheba to his advantage. Now that's a great example of somebody who couldn't overcome his temptation. But let's look at somebody who could overcome his temptation. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 40. Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 39. And we're going to look at how we can overcome temptation. Joseph right here in this chapter is somebody who overcame temptation. And why did he overcome temptation? Because he was always looking to God. He always wanted to serve the Lord to the best of his ability. He knew that he needed to do things right. And that's what we're to do as well. Is to always be willing to look to God for the answers. And right here in Genesis chapter 39, starting in verse 1, it says, Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And that's the characteristic that Joseph had that we can emulate. People can tell from us whether or not we're serving the Lord, can't they? They can point to us and say, they should be able to point to us, ideally, they can point to us and say, that's a Christian. That's somebody who wants to do things right. That's somebody who wants to serve the Lord and follow Jesus. That's somebody right there. And they were able to point to Joseph and say, that's somebody who served the Lord. And right here in verse 4, it says, So Joseph found favor in his sight, in Potiphar's sight, and served him, and made him overseer of his house, and put all that he had under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and we might want to file that one away. Remember that Joseph was handsome. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, similar to what David did with Bathsheba, cast longing eyes on him and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house. We're all alone, and he's committed all that he has to my hand. I'm in charge of this. This is my responsibility. There is no one greater in this house than I. Nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. He trusts you. He trusts me." He's saying, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Who am I to do such a thing? I can't do that." In verse 10, so it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she called him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left the garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. So friends, right there, that sounds like somebody who was headstrong, somebody who was willing to face temptation and crush it, defeat it. That's what Joseph did, and that's exactly what we can do. We have to overcome those lusts, those passions, those evil desires, the evil heart that we may have. And I want to look at one last thing. I want us to think about the birthplace of sin, where it really starts. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 15. In Matthew chapter 15, this is about the scribes and the Pharisees. They're from Jerusalem. They come to Jesus. They have a problem. They're noticing that the disciples don't wash their hands when they eat the bread. This is a major stumbling block to them. And Jesus is saying in verse 3, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition?" Why do you think that upholding your tradition is more important than obeying the commandment of God? God is saying in verse 4, "For God commanded, saying, Honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, Whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God, then he need not obey or honor his father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition." Verse 7, he says, "Hypocrites! Well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, These people draw near to me with their mouth, and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain do they worship me, teaching his commandments the doctrine of men." And Jesus is continuing to explain the parable to his disciples. And Peter's wanting to hear more. He says in verse 15, "Then Peter answered and said to him, Explain this parable to us." We can't quite get the gist of it. We can't quite understand it. And Jesus says in verse 16, "Are you also still without understanding? Do you not yet understand that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and is eliminated?" Verse 18, "But those things which proceed out of the mouth, they come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murder, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man." See, something that goes inside, that's not going to defile you. But something that's already raging inside, an evil heart, those evil thoughts, those lusts, those passions, murders, adulteries, what have you, those are the things that are going to defile you. Jesus is saying right there, those are the things that you're going to have to watch out for. And friends, I ask that today. We have lots of temptations. That's just the part of being human. We have temptations. We have lust. We have things that we lust after, things that look pleasing to us. We have to ask ourselves, what? Is this lust going to get in my way of serving God? That's what we have to do, is be willing to turn to God for the answers. Nothing that we have in this world, no possession or lust, nothing that we have in this world is as important as our soul. It's not as important as God. God must be number one in our life. He can't be tied for 10th or 50th, whatever. He has to reign supreme in our lives. And if there's somebody who has begun the steps of salvation but needs to be baptized, needs to take that next step and begin to live that wonderful Christian life, or if there is somebody who has been baptized but has begun to let the temptations and lusts of this world reign supreme over them and needs to be restored, we invite you to come forward as we stand and sing.